and to be completely honest with you, it would be a very, very big understatement for us to say that it's a very important organ. I mean, it does a lot of things. It keeps us free of bacteria, so it keeps bacteria out. Chemicals, things like that. Keeps body fluids within us. I mean, we sometimes take for granted just how much the skin does. One thing that it also does is it deals with detection of particular stimuli, and it does this via some things going on in the outer layers of the skin. And so the two layers that we're going to discuss are the epidermis and the dermis. And within these two layers, the epidermis, the outer layer of dead skin cells, and then right below that is the dermis. Contained within are the Meccano Receptors, and these receptors are the ones that respond to mechanical stimulation. So if we have pressure, if we have some vibrations against our skin, if we have any sort of stretching of our skin, you have these Meccano Receptors that actually respond to that. So just to add a different picture to your book, here on the right you see the epidermis being labeled. This is the top outer layer of dead skin. And then below it you have the dermis. Sometimes you see this bottom part called the hypodermis, but for our purposes the dermis is fine. And within each particular area you have different sorts of mechanoreceptors. And if we look here, a few of them in this picture, you've got Meisner Corpuscle. There's also a Meisner Corpuscle, which we'll talk about, that's not pictured in here. The Ruffini organ, Merkel discs, or Merkel Receptors, as your book calls them. And so let's talk a little bit about what these particular mechanoreceptors respond to. So first, let's talk about the Merkel receptor. And the Merkel receptor, along with the Meisner corpuscle, are closer to the skin of the surface, near the epidermis. And when we're talking about the Merkel receptor, it's a continuous firing as long as there is stimulation occurring. So it's a continuous firing. You can actually see this on the figure. I wrote it down. It's on page 331. You can see when there's continuous some sort of pressure that's hitting those mechanoreceptors, you actually have continuous firing. Now, the Meisner corpuscle is another mechanoreceptor that does something a little bit different. Now, remember, it is closer to the surface of the skin as well, but it is more of a discrete firing. In other words, it will fire only when at the first application of a stimulus, and then also when that stimulus is removed. So kind of a start and end to the stimulation, versus the Merkel receptor, as long as it is there and that stimulation is occurring, the firing will continue. The other mechanoreceptors that we have are the Ruffini cylinder as well as the Meisner corpuscle. Now these are deeper skin mechanoreceptors, and the cylinder, the Ruffini cylinder, is also a continuous responding situation, or continuous responding sensory receptor that as long as stimulation is occurring, it will fire. And then the Meisner corpuscle is more the on-off discrete firing pattern. Now, linking that to the behavior, your book actually does a very good job with this. If you think about the Merkel receptors and the Meisner corpuscle on the outer part of our skin, the Merkel receptor, which, remember, as long as there is stimulation, there is continuous firing, and translating that continuous firing is related to more the detection of fine details when we're talking about tactile stimulation. And then the on-off discrete firing of the Meisner corpuscle is actually related to controlling our hand grip. And so that's been some neat research that's linked that to those. The Ruffini cylinder is associated with stretching of the skin, and the Meissonian corpuscle, again, it makes sense when you have a discrete on-off kind of firing pattern that this would be related to rapid vibrations as well as fine texture. So you're getting some kind of on-off patterns there that seem to be related to our perception as well. Now, after we have our Meccano receptors and they send their responses on, we eventually want to move on up to the cortex. And the way that is going to happen is those nerves that are leaving the areas of the skin where we have all of these receptors, those are afferent nerves, meaning that they are moving toward the central nervous system. And those nerves actually enter our spinal cord via the dorsal root or the dorsal root ganglion. And that's how it gets into the spinal cord. And then we have two major pathways that move up the spinal cord toward the sensory motor cortex, or the somatosensory cortex, however you want to name it. The two pathways are the medial lemniscal pathway, and the other is the spinal thalamic pathway. Now, the medial lemniscal pathway, as I've indicated here, seems to be associated with proprioception and touch. Proprioception is really just the sense of where our body is in space. Sorry. Live recording. Huh. Okay, so proprioception, types of information about where our body is located in space, is sent on up to the somatosensory cortex via the medial lemniscal pathway along with touch. And then the spinal thalamic pathway will carry pain and temperature information on up to the somatosensory cortex. Many of you probably remember things from Introduction to Psychology dealing with pain and temperature. That was always kind of associated in a lot of intro textbooks with the parietal lobe, and that makes sense here. Note that the parietal lobe deals with more sensations of pain and temperature. But when we talk about the somatosensory cortex, we are talking about the parietal lobe. It's just a portion of it. And both of these pathways project to that particular area of the parietal lobe. But we go in through the dorsal root ganglion, into the two pathways that move up the spinal cord, and then they cross, actually. They cross to go to the opposite or the contralateral thalamus, and remember the thalamus is the gateway to the cortex. Now there is a particular area of the thalamus that deals with cutaneous types of information, and it's the ventrolateral nucleus. And remember, we have a particular area of the thalamus for vision, which was the lateral geniculate nucleus. We have the medial geniculate nucleus that dealt with auditory information, and for cutaneous or touch types of information that's moving up these two pathways, we're going to move through the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and eventually arrive at area S1 and S2 of the cortex. This is the primary, S1 is the primary somatosensory cortex, and S2 is the secondary somatosensory cortex. Now, the way, just to kind of take us back through, if you look down here, you've got your finger, and let's say it's been, these Meccano receptors have been stimulated. If you follow your pathway, if you follow the pink or the magenta, it's an afferent fiber that's going to go into the spinal cord. Here's our dorsal root ganglion. Just so we're all on the same page, dorsal roots bring information into the spinal cord. Ventral roots take information out. So sensory comes in through dorsal, motor goes out through ventral. But if we follow our pathway, you've got your two pathways that go up here, and they cut through the ventral-posterior nucleus of the thalamus, or the ventrolateral thalamus, and then on up into our parietal lobe. Remember, we're looking at a coronal section, so we've got a plane here, a coronal plane of the brain or the cortex, and this moves on up into our somatosensory cortex, area S1, in this particular picture of our parietal lobe. Now, when we move up to the somatosensory cortex, just so we are on the same page, if we're looking at the left side of it, of our cortex, notice that here's your premotor cortex, here's your primary motor cortex area right here. Just past the central sulcus, moving posteriorly, you've got your primary somatosensory cortex, and notice that this whole somatosensory cortex has a very close link to our primary motor cortex, which makes sense if we think about sensory motor behavior. They must work together continuously. So here you have your primary somatosensory cortex, area S1, and then right down here is your secondary somatosensory cortex, S2. And notice you have other areas here. So this is our somatosensory cortex. And one curious thing about our somatosensory cortex is it is very well organized, and it's organized in such a way to represent the parts of our body as it relates to areas that are sometimes more or less sensitive to particular stimulation. And so this is actually called the homunculus. Your book shows you the direct translation of this. It's essentially a little man that's mapped onto your somatosensory cortex as well as your primary motor cortex as well, such that each area of the body is represented by a certain area on the somatosensory cortex as well as the motor cortex. And actually this was documented as noted in your book, and I pulled a figure from that paper from Penfield, Wilder Penfield, however you want to say it, but in the 50s discovered that this was happening. It was more of an interesting experiment where you had awake individuals who had been missing parts of their skull, and what better way to find out what happens than when you touch different parts and then ask them what they're feeling in different parts of their bodies. And so Penfield was able to map this out. It's a little bit difficult to see from this original picture, but here's your somatosensory cortex. Here's your motor cortex. You have similar types of ideas here, but you move from the genitals, the toes. Each area is representing a different part of the body: foot, leg, hip, trunk, neck, on down, shoulder, your fingers, eye, nose, face, upper lip, lips, and you can kind of notice that the hand area is pretty big. Actually, your thumb and your finger have different sizes, and that means that the larger they are and the more sensitive they are, the more of the area they're actually going to take up on the somatosensory cortex, which actually relates back to the cortical magnification factor. We talked about the fovea actually taking up a lot more of the visual cortex due to its fineness of discrimination. Now here's a clearer picture of it, just so you can see this kind of mapping. You've got motor here this time and sensory here on the right, so you can kind of see the genitals, the foot, knee, on down, and you go all the way down to the face, the lips, the teeth, the gums. And again, you can kind of see how big the hands are. Well, that makes sense. They're going to have a larger representation because they are very sensitive. Other parts of your body are not going to be as sensitive, and this has to do with the distribution of the receptors, the sensory receptors across your body. There are varied amounts of receptors there. Now, what's interesting is that this body mapping that you see, especially in the somatosensory cortex, is not a rigid type of mapping, and it changes with experience. And one thing that we know, mainly from the work of Dr. Michael Merzenich, who we'll talk about in a second, if you're using or performing a particular function that's related to a particular area on the cortex there, on the somatosensory cortex, the more you use that function, the larger that cortical representation actually becomes. And one just kind of note back to the topic of experience-dependent plasticity, as you're doing something, the changes that you actually see real time, which is actually some of the work that Merzenich has done, is a good representation of experience-dependent plasticity. It's a change in the representation as a function of the experience. And so just to kind of give you a little bit of information about Michael Merzenich, this was work done in the 80s and on into the 90s, and he still does work with this, although he's moved into more of an applied type of area. But in the 80s, he was doing some of the work with monkeys, and I'll show you a very quick diagram from one of his studies from the mid-80s that dealt with reorganization of the cortical areas in owl monkeys. But he has found information that you're able to look at and see these cortical representations in areas of the somatosensory cortex, and so they get a baseline of what the representations look like, and then they actually have monkeys, for instance, use a particular finger to do something more frequently than they would normally, and then they measure the change in the representation. And what they see is the more they practice with certain digits, so for instance, if they use a finger to touch things more frequently, that is a change in real time that's actually happening. And you see that the representation on the somatosensory cortex for that particular digit that they were practicing with more actually increases. And it's a very clear demonstration of the continuous change as a function of the stimulation that's actually occurring. And just to give you another example, this was a study done in 1984 where you can kind of see here, there's an owl monkey. This is the normal owl monkey where all digits are actually in place, nothing has been done, and so you see, you consider this like a pointer finger, the second finger, the third finger, the fourth finger, and the fifth finger. You see that they all have this representation. And then what he ended up doing, this is one of those, it's a great experiment, but if you're a monkey person, I apologize. They actually removed the third digit. So they amputated a digit, and then they tracked after they removed the third digit. This is a picture of the representation on the somatosensory cortex and how it has changed about 62 days after they amputated that third digit. So you see that you've got areas 1, 2, 4, and 5. So where area 3 used to be, areas 2 and 4 have actually expanded due to probably the increased use of the digits around where the third digit used to be. So it's a very clear example of experience-dependent plasticity. So here's the activity that I'd like everybody to do. I'm going to give you the link here to a TED Talk delivered by Michael Merzenich. It's under 30 minutes, and it's actually quite enjoyable. So here's the link. You should be able to either pause this video and type it in, or you could actually just go online to Google, type in TED Talk Michael Merzenich, and it should come up. He'll be wearing a yellow shirt.